Good morning and a very warm welcome to the webinar East Meets West presented by the Europe Asia Center. My name is Gajšek. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center, and I'm truly honored to welcome such an esteemed panel of excellencies and experts that have joined today's discussion, diving deeper into the topic of the EU's leading role in the global internet governance. With the rise and integration of digital platforms into almost every single dimension of European life, Europe recognized the need to regulate not only the benefits of digital transformation, but also the disadvantages and risks such as the negative influence on the fundamental rights, state of democracies, societies, and economies at large. And it is the Digital Markets Act that presents another legislative step of the European bloc towards strengthening the European strategic autonomy and tackling of the competition rules. And without further ado, I would like to invite the chairman of Europe Asia Center, Ambassador Piet, to present us with his opening notes. Ambassador Still, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matic, and good morning to everyone. In our webinar. I am also very happy to see the member of European Parliament, the Honourable Mr. Schwab here, and also a former minister from Slovenia. It's a great honor to have a short discussion this morning on indeed the Digital Markets Act and the importance of it historically. And I'm not a great fan of superlatives, such as the word historic and seminal, but on the 24th of March this year, the Council of the European Union and the European Parliament together, when they reached a political agreement on the Digital Markets Act, those words, of historic and seminal were not an exaggeration to describe the true significance of that piece of legislation. And at the same time, much progress has achieved in the adoption of the Digital Services Act, which actually was politically agreed upon 2 months later. So the Digital Markets Act intends to ensure a higher degree of competition and level playing field in the European digital markets by preventing big tech companies from abusing their market power and by allowing, and that's important, new players to enter the market. And as you know, the Digital Services Act updated the European Union's existing legal framework for illegal and harmful content, hate speech, political and health-related disinformation, and so on and so forth. So the Digital Services Act is certainly a world first in the field of digital regulation. And maybe I'm not the only one, and certainly not the last one, when I refer to the former Facebook employee, Frances Hogan, and I think she was right when she appeared in the European Parliament and said that to tackle ongoing digital abuses, Europe needs a strong law and a firm enforcement to take back control of its citizens' fundamental rights. And I think this is what actually happened, and we are very grateful to Dr. Schwab, to take the role of a rapporteur. Indeed, to have this strong law and to have this also, we will see the firm enforcements of the law. So this is a bit the background and my introduction for today, to have an open discussion, and we will be very keen to listen to our two keynote speakers. And I give the floor now to Matic, to introduce our two keynote speakers. Thank you, Matic.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Still, for your address and profound words. And now it's really a true pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Dr. Andreas Schwab. As already introduced by our chairman, Dr. Schwab has been a member of the European Parliament for Germany's Christian Democratic Union Party since 2004, and was also the lead MEP rapporteur on the Digital Markets Act. He's the European People's Party group coordinator in the Committee on the Internal Market and Consumer Protection, a substitute member of the Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs, and a member of the Bureau of the EPP Group. Prior to his election in the European Parliament, Dr. Schwab worked in legal sphere for the Ministry of Culture, Youth and Sports in Stuttgart, and as a private secretary to the minister. Dr. Schwab, the pleasure and honor is all ours to invite you to our virtual floor.
Thank you, Matic, for that very kind introduction, and thanks, Ambassador, for the invitation. It's my pleasure to outline some key concerns that the Digital Markets Act wants to address, and that we as Europeans want to include in the legislation to make sure that fairness and contestability of markets is ensured. And this is a very important topic, and it's also a very sensitive topic. And therefore, I will not now praise several elements of this law that I think can shed some light into quite intransparent operations of digital markets. Ambassador, colleagues, I would like to start with a comment that the American ambassador in Europe, Mr. Gajšek, has made yesterday evening at a meeting. He said, the European Union is the strongest regulator in the world. And I think this is very positive, but it's also a high level of responsibility that is linked to it. And therefore, we have to outline with great detail and with a strong commitment why we have gone for this legislation. And I would like to start with that we want to defend our democracies. And if we are so strong as a regulator, we defend not only the democracies in the European Union and in Europe at large, but we also want to do so at global level. This is for sure a very humble comment, because in the end, democracies are where they are in the countries, but democracies can only function if every single citizen has the strong belief and can also have the commitment to make his or her own career, his or her own business, his or her own success. And there can be no state authority that stops them from being successful if they abide by the law. And there should be no company and no bottleneck in the digital area that stops them from making their success. Because if we destroy that individual belief with citizens, with people, we will have a problem. But secondly, and this is a bit a link to the DSA, the same applies also for the communication. For sure, also in the newspapers, there are stupid comments. For sure, also in restaurants, you know, in the classical Stammtisch in German, we call it like that, the table, the bar where people after 7 beers still speak, for sure there is also stupid stuff, but it remains there. And if the guy has too many beers, people are saying, go home, you are drunk. But in the internet and in social media platforms, you get the impression that this is normal. And worse even, the worse you comment, the more advertisement will be linked to your comment. And like that, there is that spiral, that toxic spiral that misleads thousands of people. And the problem is here that most of all, this is affecting smaller countries, economically poor countries, or countries with a language that is not that much spoken, because these companies, as Ms. Hogan has outlined, they invest for the US and for English. They invest, fortunately, for German, because we are a big country, but they invest much less in countries that are much less rich and much less important. And that means that in those countries, if they are connected, and they connect because they want to be part of the Western world and of economic upgrade, they will be then destroying themselves, because there are these sort of discussions. And therefore, we believe that we have a responsibility for democracy. But secondly, we have also a responsibility for economy, because a good economy is the backbone of globalization. Globalization will only be successful if people, states, heads of state and politicians have the feeling that there is something that they can win if they are good, if they are brilliant, if they invest, that they will not be cheated by the others. And the algorithms that we have been seeing are, unfortunately, to a certain extent, elements that have been misprivileging some of the companies, and although their services and innovation has been better than those of the companies that have been the incumbents, or as we call them a bit now, gatekeepers. For that reasons, these two elements have made us, also with some backward looking in German history, where these monopolies that have been able to be built have been destroying democracy in our country, which has made the Americans to impose on us more contestability of German markets after the Second World War, to go for the Digital Markets Act. And the Digital Markets Act, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, I want to outline quickly, because I think I have only a few minutes left, and then it's my pleasure also to listen to Boris. The Digital Markets Act starts a new era of tech regulation because we want that the digital markets are shaped by all companies that have to make a good input. And the choice, what is good and what is bad, has to be done with competitors, with users, and with consumers. And it has not to be done by those that control the steering mechanisms for the bottlenecks. We believe that putting an end to the e-commerce directive that wanted to give an incentive for platforms to grow, we have come over to this. And therefore, I still believe that we could go now into a lot of details of what we want to do to avoid self-preferencing, how we want to avoid conflicts of interest, how we want to minimize data leveraging. But I will be very happy, Matic, to do that. But I think at that moment in time, I should stop because I gave you a very general outline, and I'm very happy to go into the details later. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schwab, for your keynote address and a very informative insight shared on the, as you say yourself, very significant topic that is underlying our democracies. And now I'm truly delighted to welcome our second keynote speaker, Mr. Boris Andrijanic, who is actually the former Minister for Digitalization of Republic of Slovenia. He served this post as a first ever Minister of Digital Transformation between the years 2021-2022. During Slovenian presidency of the Council of EU, he chaired the Telecommunication and Energy Council and Competitiveness Council. Under his leadership, actually, the member states approved the general approach to the Digital Services Act and made significant progress on the European Declaration on Digital Rights and Principles. He also chaired the Slovenian Digitalization Council. Prior to his political involvement, he also led Uber's public policy and government relations in Europe, in Central and Eastern Europe, establishing partnerships with national and local governments towards green and shared mobility. Without further ado, Mr. Andrijanic, the virtual floor is yours.
Dear Matic, thanks so much for your kind introduction. As you noted, I'm enjoying a very active political retirement, so I can't really complain. Now, dear friends, first let me thank the ambassador and the Europe Asia Center for organizing today's expert roundtable. Let me start with the big picture by saying that the current geopolitical tensions underpinned by the war in Ukraine make the EU's leadership in regulating cyberspace even more important and indispensable than ever before. Now, these circumstances also create a new sense of urgency, I believe, for a multilateral approach to cyberspace governance, especially in areas like cybersecurity, digital markets, but also AI. I also believe there is absolutely no alternative to a comprehensive global dialogue and action, indeed, if we want to reverse the emerging trend of a multipolar digital world. Now, I mentioned a lot of the challenges in the past couple of seconds, but let me add that despite the myriad of challenges we face today, I would like to be cautiously optimistic about Europe's vision of an inclusive and human-centric digital transformation. As we all know, and this is something that Andreas already noted, the good news is that the EU has a long tradition of creating and indeed exporting forward-looking regulations in various areas. Just look at our privacy and environmental legislation and standards. They have been copied all over the world, and I think this is something we should be very, very proud of. However, the not so good news is that we are not nearly as good at creating and exporting digital services. For years, and here we need to be frank, Europe has lagged behind the US and China in digital innovation and technological progress. If you just look at the top 30 global tech companies, only one is European. I'm talking, of course, about the German SAP, established almost 50 years ago. Let me give you another interesting piece of statistics. In the past decade, over 600 companies around the world went on to become unicorns. Only 1 out of 8 is European. Now, there is absolutely no doubt that we need comprehensive regulation of digital markets and services to ensure fair competition and safeguard our core values. However, we also need to create an environment that will breed digital champions of the future. How to get there of course, is a $1 trillion, or let's say €1 trillion question. We must complete the single market, especially for digital and other services. That will allow our startups to scale their operations across the continent without being forced to hire a legion of lawyers. We need to boost research funding and encourage closer collaboration between our excellent universities and the industry. And last but not least, we need to make it easier for our businesses to raise capital and attract top talent. The reason for my optimism that I mentioned in the beginning is that the EU is making significant progress on many of these fronts. The swift adoption of the Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act has demonstrated our ability to address novel and very complex challenges in an innovative, expedient, yet consensual way. Data Governance Act will create a European single market for data, which is absolutely essential for the growth of our digital economy. We're also increasing funding for strategic projects in AI, cloud computing, and other vital areas. Moreover, the RRF represents a historic opportunity to supercharge the digital transformation of the member states and bridge the digital divide in line with ambitions set out in the Digital Compass. It's great to see many European countries already racing ahead, proving that it can be done. Estonia, for example, is a home of 10 tech unicorns, while Sweden boasts global giants like Spotify and Klarna. I'm proud that the last year's Slovenian presidency achieved important milestones in a number of these areas. Crucially, we reached general approaches to DSA and DMA. In both cases, we worked very hard to secure a carefully balanced compromise that enjoyed the support of all member states. And this is something I'm truly proud of. As you can imagine, that was far from easy, but in the end, I would say that a sense of great urgency and common understanding prevailed. Here, obviously, I must thank the German and Portuguese presidencies that helped achieve these breakthroughs. Now, thanks to my esteemed colleague, Andreas, the DMA is now a reality, and so is the DSA. He has spoken very eloquently about the benefits of DMA, so let me focus more on the DSA and what it brings to European citizens. As you know, DSA is, together with DMA, at the very core of the EU's digital strategy that was laid out in 2020. Both pieces of regulation aim to ensure a trustworthy online environment, level the playing field, and foster innovation. They also bring, and this is important, a much needed legal clarity for internet businesses. The DSA is modernizing parts of the e-commerce directive that represented the first ever legal framework for online services in the EU, but it was adopted over 20 years ago, so it was grossly outdated. The DSA enshrined new liability rules related to illegal goods, services, and content online, and introduced additional transparency requirements and risk management mechanisms for all online intermediary services. It also aims to empower users as well as the civil society by making it easier to challenge platforms' content moderation decisions and seek redress. I would say that in one sentence, the most important contribution of the DSA is that what is illegal offline should also be illegal online. This is the overarching principle that guided all of our work on this important act. I must say that during the presidency negotiations, we did our best to align the interests of the so-called maximalist and minimalist groups of EU countries. Hence, we clarified and enhanced the scope and the horizontal nature of the act, while at the same time preserving the key principles of the e-commerce directive, namely the liability exemption, country of origin, and no general monitoring obligation. We have also added provisions for the protection of minors, expanded obligations for online marketplaces and search engines, and introduced much stricter rules for very large online platforms. We have also included a mechanism that ensures effective enforcement and supervision, while at the same time preserving the already mentioned principle of country of origin. At the same time, we really did our best to try to limit the regulatory burden for SMEs. But as Winston Churchill once famously said, however beautiful the strategy, you should occasionally look at the results. That's why I think timely and meticulous implementation will be absolutely essential to make both the DMA and DSA a success. Much will therefore depend on the Commission as well as the member states. We should also keep in mind other pioneering pieces of Europe's digital legislation that are in the making, most notably the AI Act, which will represent the first comprehensive horizontal legislation in this area in the world. As you know, this act seeks to codify the high standards of AI algorithms and their application, combining a risk-based approach with an effective enforcement mechanism. We made significant progress on the AI Act during our presidency, and I truly hope that it will be adopted during the Czech presidency, which is starting today. In the end, let me emphasize once again the need for international dialogue on all of these fronts. We all know that AI, as well as many other advanced technologies, know of no borders or other limits. Therefore, I think it is crucial for the world's democracies to work together in harvesting their limitless potential, but also when it comes to addressing the growing challenges. That's why I believe the creation of the EU-US Trade and Technology Council was the right step forward, because it offers a much needed platform that is both comprehensive and solution-oriented. But of course, we need to be patient and work very hard on the outcomes. But I do believe that in the end, we will reach significant progress on a number of issues, be it reduction of trade barriers, ensuring supply chain security, especially when it comes to semiconductors, also in the area of AI governance and securing data flows, which is a very important topic that gets oftentimes underlooked. So in the end, I can say that with our international partners, we will never agree on every detail, but there is absolutely no alternative to cooperation and joint international, if not even global action. I'll be happy to comment on other topics later on.
Thank you so much, Mr. Andrijanic, for a truly in-depth crash keynote. Yeah, I think it was giving us a lot of points to address afterwards in the conversation. I'm truly delighted. Actually, the transition now was in topic towards AI was kind of beautifully made with me introducing the next guest. We are really delighted to kind of host two experts and practitioners to this round table. And the next person introducing is Dr. Sebastian Hallensleben, who is the chair of CEN-CENELEC JTC 21, where the EU AI standards that underpin the EU regulation are actually being developed. He's a member of the expert advisory board of the EU StandICT program and the chair of the Trusted Information Working Group. He co-chairs the Classification and Risk Assessment Working Group at OECD ONE.AI and has roles in AI committees in IEC, Council of Europe, and UNESCO. Dr. Sebastian Hallensleben also has the digitalization and artificial intelligence at the VDE, Association for Electrical, Electronic and Information Technologies, where he's responsible for new product and service development, as well as for advising and developing frameworks for both German Parliament, federal ministries and European Commission. He focuses particularly on the AI ethics, on handling the impact of generative AI, building privacy, preserving trust infrastructures, as well as characterizing the AI quality. Previously, Dr. Hallensleben has also been working on dialogue between academia, industry, and policymaking, as well as in international infrastructure projects development for waste, energy, and drinking water. Dr. Hallensleben, the honor is really ours to have you as our expert guest, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction, and also thanks for the opportunity to join the discussion today. I'd like to kick off by echoing the previous remarks on the fundamental importance of both the DMA and the DSA. And I cannot really add anything to the remarks made by those who've been deeply involved in making those two important pieces of legislation happen. So what I would like to do is to look forward and to consider and offer a few thoughts on, well, what could come next? Because we have to be clear that as important as the DMA and the DSA are, they are mainly focused on preventing the bad. They are not so much focused on fostering the good. That's not a criticism. It's just beyond the scope of those two pieces of legislation. And in my view, we need to start considering, well, what is the good that we can foster and what can we do, and where do we need to focus our resources in Europe? I'd like to highlight three possible directions or three possible steps that we can take here. First of all, I'd like to remind ourselves that the discussion has very much concentrated, coalesced around platforms. When we talk about the internet, when we talk about what's going wrong in the digital space and what needs to change in the digital space, we almost immediately talk about platforms. It wasn't always like that. If you wind back to the very early days of the internet, the buzzwords weren't any platforms. The buzzwords were TCP/IP. The buzzwords were Usenet. Buzzwords were email, SMTP, POP3. The buzzwords were HTTP, HTML. So all those buzzwords that created the internet in the early days, they weren't platforms. They were protocols. They were protocols and standards. And it's worth noting that no one owns email. Email is not a platform. So therefore, there can be no gatekeepers for email, because anyone who sets up a server, connects that server to the internet and follows a certain set of protocols is participating in the worldwide email system. I believe that it's worth thinking about social media, thinking about messaging, again, not so much as a platform issue, but as a set of protocols. And that gives us automatically things like messaging interoperability. It also gives a different perspective onto the issue of content access or content filtering and prioritization. And it also gives a different perspective on the issue of identity. So that's my first point, the transition, not just looking at platforms, but also looking again at protocols that we need to establish. The second direction in which I believe we need to look beyond the DMA and the DSA is the question of digital identity. At present, there are essentially three kinds of digital identities. First of all, there are the unverified accounts that we all create if we join a platform of any kind. We just pick a username and that's it. We've got an account, we've got a digital identity. Second kind of identity are accounts that are verified in some form. Famous example is Twitter with the blue tick mark that indicates, yep, this is actually happens to be the real name of a person. And the third kind of identity, digital identity, are the identities that derive from some sort of government-issued ID, be it under the eIDAS regulation or be it in the context of the upcoming European digital identity. Those existing available kinds of digital identities contain some danger. So first of all, much of those identities, in fact, the unverified accounts and also the kind of commercial real name verified ones, they tend to be in the hands of exactly the gatekeepers that the DMA is talking about. And if Apple decides to turn off my Apple ID, or if Facebook decides to close down my account, or if Microsoft decides to withdraw my Microsoft account, I have no recourse, no realistic recourse. There is no accountability, there is no sovereignty, and there is no possibility for a judicial review. So from my perspective, it's very dangerous to leave identity or the power of identity in the hands of the gatekeepers. And the second danger is something that we've been looking at for a long time, actually for the past 2-3 years, is the rise of AI automated bots using technologies around deepfakes, around GPT-3, that make it possible to create fake identities and fake human beings at scale. And it's not enough to just trust detection tools and fact-checking to counteract that, because at best we enter an arms race, and we will not have a substantial way of combating bots. And in fact, the scalability of fakes, the arbitrary scalability of fakes, means that we don't just have a challenge to ensure freedom of speech in the digital space, we've also got a challenge in terms of ensuring fairness of speech. So the notion that human beings online have a sort of fair chance of being heard or being seen, rather than having to compete with hundreds or thousands of bots that just swamp the speech of real human beings. This is a topic that deserves its own discussion. Maybe that's a hint to the Europe Asia Center as well. So we believe that beyond the DMA and the DSA, we need to think about digital identity infrastructures, pseudonymous identity infrastructures, and also identities that are in some form privacy protecting, which actually nicely ties in with the current emergence of privacy enhancing technologies as a buzzword, and also pseudonyms that have a certain level of singularity. And finally, the third direction in which we should think beyond the DMA and the DSA are the business model for content creation and content curation. We've really become addicted as a whole, as a society, to the business model of visibly or invisibly selling our data in return for free, or let's say not monetarily paid content. And I would contend that this business model, data-supported, ad-supported content, is a kind of cross-sectional gatekeeper. And we need to take action to encourage competition, to encourage other models of content creation and content curation. We need to ask ourselves, why are the alternatives, for example, subscription models that of course exist, micropayments that of course exist, why are they still stuck in certain niches? Why haven't they managed to be a viable, broad alternative that would then also enable us to prevent the downsides of ad-supported models like polarization, the sharing of more and more extreme content, and so on? Maybe we need to look at flat rate models. Maybe we need to look at inspiration from the way that public broadcasters are funded, or maybe we even need to look at inspiration from very, very old ways in which, for example, blank cassette tapes were essentially taxed and the money was distributed to content creators at the time. So those are the three directions in which I would encourage us to look and think to take the next steps beyond the DMA and the DSA. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hallensleben, for really very deep insight. I would like to now welcome our last expert guest, last but definitely not least. I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Miguel Otero-Iglesias. He's a senior analyst at Elcano Royal Institute and professor of practice at IE School of Global and Public Affairs. Dr. Otero-Iglesias worked as a research associate at the EU Asia Institute at ESSCA School of Management in France, and was previously also an assistant professor in international political economy at the same university. As well, adjunct lecturer at Queen Elizabeth House at the University of Oxford, postdoctoral researcher fellow at LSE, and associate lecturer at Oxford Brookes University, where he also obtained his PhD. Interestingly, for this discussion, he's also leading a flagship research project on the topic of the digital revolution and the new social contract at the IE University. So, Dr. Miguel Otero-Iglesias, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Matic, and thanks for the invitation as well to the Europe Asia Center. Hello, Dr. Schwab. We met once at Ana Palacios dinner not long ago, talking about this topic. So great to be here, exchanging views on this. a lot has been said, so I'm not going to repeat the importance and as the chair, Mr. Steele said, the certainly perhaps historic or certainly historic impact of this legislation. I just wanted to kind of point out a few things that I think are important for this discussion. One of them obviously relates to Mr. Andrijanic's points, which is that we have now a stream of new legislation coming down the pipeline. I think this is a good approach in terms of the comprehensiveness of the regulatory framework that we have. But I'm a bit concerned about the consistency of all this legislation and how we put these things together, how consistent they are, how they talk to each other, and as well kind of the impact that they might have on our innovation capacity, whether we might not be over-regulating, which leads us to another point that Boris, if I may, mentioned, which is that we cannot only be the referee, the arbiter, we need to be the players in the game, and we don't have the players. We need to develop the players, and I would agree with a lot of what Boris said in terms of the things that need to be done. But I think we cannot work in silos, and we need to deepen as well things that are basic for a political community, which is a fiscal and political union. We can talk for ages about creating a single market, creating a capital markets union, but history tells us, and the United States history for starters, that it's very difficult to create single markets and digital single markets and properly functioning monetary unions, one could argue, and capital markets unions. Without fiscal deepening. And that's just a reality. We need a risk-free asset. We need our own federal debt, if you want. We start with Next Generation EU. I think it's a very important next step. But in times of war, in the context of war, as we are today, and with, I just saw the Ukrainian parliament putting in the European flag in the parliament with cheers across the spectrum of political forces. I mean, this is a historic moment, right? That someone really says, look, we want to really belong to this political community, and has the flag that Dr. Schwab has behind him, as part of their identity. That's very, very, very strong. And if we want to win this, we will need to deepen our fiscal union, no matter what. The next years will be hard, as you all know. Because the economic environment will be difficult because of what all you know, with the inflation levels, with war fatigue kicking in, and we might need, this is, historically, that's how political unions develop, right? In times of duress, in times of, perhaps external threats. And so my point is always, look, we need to deepen fiscal union in order to create a single market and capital markets union, or what we need to actually have then global players. But given this very broad, more abstract perhaps analysis, I wanted to delve into some of the details of the DMA that perhaps we could discuss, or that perhaps Dr. Schwab or Mr. Andrijanic can perhaps address, because they are of my concern. One is whether we will create a special unit in the European Commission that deals with digital markets, that is able to have the expertise, the know-how, the knowledge to be able to regulate and supervise these markets, and as well to liaise with all the different agencies, units at both the European level and at member states level to have the coherence and consistency that I talked about at the beginning. Okay, I think that's truly important, and I'm concerned because there's not many people with the human capital to deal with this, to understand algorithms, to understand the technical sides. They are obviously attracted by the industry, And I'm worried whether we will have, the capacities to actually supervise this. Secondly, are we convinced that we need to have periodic revisions of our legal framework? I mean, the DMA, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Schwab, will be revised in 3 years. 3 years is a world. It's a decade in the 20th century. Perhaps the first one could be 3 years, but I think we just published under my kind of direction. We have this, as Matic was saying, this digital revolution and the new social contract project here at University. Andrea published a very good piece on the DMA, and he was concerned about that perhaps we need to have revisions every 2 years. I know this is very difficult, but we need to find the way that our legal machinery works as fast as possible to keep up with the high, pace that the digital economy is developing. Third, and this is perhaps of more concern, especially if we move more to an ex-ante approach on fostering competition and level playing fields, which is, are we developing the technical capacities to have relatively low or zero friction of communication sharing by the big players, by these platforms? Almost automatic information sharing with the regulators, so that the regulators are capable to actually supervise. I mean, there are some buzzwords here. I'm sure you know them: RegTech, regulatory tech, subtech, supervision tech. I mean, are we committed to have this regulatory capacity and enforcement so that the information flows generally? And then I'm, of course, that's my last point, and I'm not going to go longer. I'm a bit worried as well about the asymmetries in terms of lobbying and influence, etc. I mean, from the people I talked to, it seems that there will be a battery of legal challenges against DMA by some of the big fish. So that's going to be a legal burden already from the start. And then just generally, I think, the lobbying will continue to be massive. I'm sure Dr. Schwab knows more about this. Do we have as well the mechanisms to have influence, advisory roles, advisory councils, where the civil society is involved? The NGOs, the academia, the other side of the debate, so that we, in the next decade, in this digital decade that we want to develop, that we have less asymmetries in terms of expertise and influence on these topics. And I leave it there, and thanks again for the invitation and the exchange.
Thank you so much, Dr. Otero. And now I would really actually like to invite, we don't have so much more time left, but we have a bit of time to at least, let's say, bite in a few of the topics that were actually raised during the addresses of each and one of you. And maybe I just open it very broadly that I also actually want to quote Ms. Frances Hogan, who during the testifying of the European Parliament said that the Digital Service Act adopted by the European Parliament has the potential of becoming the global gold standard. So maybe I would like to kind of open on this conversation, aligning it with one of the questions that was raised by Dr. Hallensleben, which was like, what is the good that we can foster for the future, and pose the question to Dr. Schwab and Mr. Andrijanic, since the legislative framework was really outlined during your time framework. How can we really ensure that this Brussels effect will be going on? And also as one of the concerns raised by Dr. Otero, that that the lobbying will not have too much impact on that process, and that this Brussels effect could go beyond the scope of European Union, reflecting on the opening note of Dr. Schwab with the American ambassador.
Well, I think this is extremely interesting, this debate, and also the arguments that were made by Miguel, and I would like to come back also quickly on what Sebastian has said. So perfectly a law will never be. done. Therefore, there will always be a need to adapt it. But I don't believe that the DMA will be opened in 3 years. It will take much longer time for the DMA to be applied over time, to be able to judge as to whether it has set the right incentives. Because you may have seen that the DMA has plenty of provisions that all have to be implemented by the European authorities, in that case by the European Commission. And as Boris has rightly mentioned, it will be fully harmonizing the rules all over Europe, and therefore we will have the full experience, the full picture only, I would say, in 10 years. And there is so much flexibility in it. If you take, for example, the front conditions for social media search and platforms and app stores. If you take, for example, the conflict of interest, the ban of self-preferencing, there are so many open legal concepts that we will take time also to see what the court will decide about them. And therefore, I don't think that there will be a change. And it's not even needed because it's very flexible and open, the regulation. And secondly, that was the point that came out last with Miguel, I think there will be some sort of discussions between gatekeepers and authorities. Although Article 5 are self-executing norms, they are self-executing, but in the end, it will be important that the companies admit and commit before applying them to the Commission how they want to do that, so that it's clear and that there is no loophole and no misunderstanding. And in that regulatory dialogue, I'm sure that solutions can be found. Thirdly, I think that the DMA in its broad range, together with the DSA, is covering those questions that we want to address, not only in Web 2, but also in Web 3. Hoping that then, as Sebastian has mentioned, we come back to an internet where the variety of services is the strength and not the centralization of storage places that invites to misuse data and hides to normal eyes also how data are used. And if you allow me, Matic, to come back on that last point, I had yesterday a very interesting meeting with Ofcom, and they have reminded me that the reasons and the rules on advertisement and the transparency on advertisement will create a huge new discussion about how ads are created, how they are paid, and how they are used. The Commission has already launched a procedure under 101 and 102 of the treaty, but the DMA will push strongly in that direction. And so I think it will also be a tool to transparency. And it's a bit sad, I would agree with Sebastian, that this has to be done by a law that is focusing only on a few companies, but it's also true that these few companies control all of this. So we will fix the problem, hopefully, with this, and then allow for a decentralization again. Not being bad with any company, but being positive with all companies that want to bring back innovation, new ideas, better services. And I wouldn't exclude that also some of the gatekeepers will improve their services then, so there will be competition.
Thank you. I think Mr. Andrijanic is ready to jump in.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much for great remarks from all the sides. Let me first focus on the consistency of legislation. I think this is a very good point because we've seen a flood of digital regulation in the past couple of years. It took only a matter of 2 to 3 years to get some of the most complex and sophisticated pieces of European regulation adopted and implemented, which is a great thing from one perspective, but can also be problematic from another perspective. Now, I agree with Andreas that these rules are to a largest possible extent harmonized, but in the end, we will only see how they work once they're implemented in practice. And I think what's very important to me and what's been very important during our conversations with other member states is that we remain flexible, that we assess the implications of these new regulations in practice and then act accordingly. These regulations should be set in stone for the next 10 or 20 years because they can generate unintended consequences that might prove adverse to our small and medium enterprises. and other parts of the society. So I think it's very important that we rush through this regulation, which I think is up to the standard, but still we need to be vigilant. We need to observe how these regs work out in practice and adjust them if necessary. They should not be holy cows, or let's say the untouchables. Then the next point that I wanted to make was about the supervisory capacity of the European Commission. This obviously is a challenge, and that's why in the end we also agree to the supervisory fee that will basically help finance this additional capacity, let's say this additional workforce that will be brought into the European Commission to supervise the big internet firms. Now, Andreas made a very good point about smaller countries being more exposed to phenomena like misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda. We've seen it during the war in Ukraine very vividly. We all know that the Baltic states and smaller Central and Eastern European countries are the first line of attack for all kinds of Russian propaganda, misinformation, and disinformation. And very few big internet platforms had, at the time when the war erupted, any physical presence in this country, which means that there were very little, if any, native speakers in countries like Estonia, which was under heavy pressure, Lithuania, Latvia, also Slovakia, Slovenia, but even Poland, with its 38 million citizens, did not have native speakers when it comes to certain big internet platforms. And obviously the DSA cannot address or solve the situation. But what we made sure is that we pressed these platforms to ramp up their resources to make sure this fight against Russian propaganda is more effective. Truth be told, there has been significant progress on their part, but we're still not there. So I fully support what Andreas said. There needs to be a constant dialogue, even pressure on the big platforms to make sure they treat all of their markets within the EU equally, because this kind of threats are part of a cyber war that's being waged very intensely right now, and we see no signs of waning. The last point that I would make is about freedom of expression. Okay, this is, I think, a fundamental point that we haven't touched upon during this debate, but I think what many people don't comprehend fully is that the DSA primarily focus on illegal content, meaning illegal speech. And when it comes to harmful but legal content, it basically doesn't go that far as it does with the illegal content. Now, we know that when it comes to the illegal content, we only have certain illegal content harmonized at the EU level. I'm talking about terrorism, I'm talking about child abuse. Everything else is in the domain of the member states, what they deem as illegal offline and hence online. So this is an important point. And I think this debate about freedom of expression was very much alive during our presidency negotiations and will be alive later on. I think the DSA actually strengthens this fundamental freedom by strengthening mechanisms for redress and for complaints to all kinds of content regulation decisions by the big platforms. So this is something that we will keep struggling with, and we'll see how it works out in practice. And it's something that should remain our focus, since our citizens are rightly so very concerned about this point.
Matic, this has been so interesting what Mark Boris said. I just would like to mention to you that I have to go now to the conference of the OECD. It has been a great pleasure to be here, and I hope that we can stay in touch. Ambassador, colleagues, please apologize Please accept my apologies. I will now go out. Thank you so much for the interesting debate.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schwab, and thank you for your participation. And maybe we pose also the final notes now from Miguel and Sebastian and Ambassador Steele, and then we wrap up the discussion. So maybe, yeah, Miguel is ready to.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, I agree with a lot of what was said. So thank you to the organizers again for making this happening. As I said, I mean, perhaps the thing that we have not really addressed sufficiently, obviously, is that, I don't know who mentioned, I think it was Boris, I mean, the multipolarity, right, that might come up. And I'm and this is a West and East dialogue forum. I'm worried about the narrative that is emerging between democracies and autocracies. I think that's generally counterproductive. I mean, that leads us straight into a bloc mentality, a division of our relations, of our ways of understanding, human interactions, etc. And I think that's highly problematic in the context that we have right now. And values might be a bit different in different places, but we still need to coexist, exchange views, exchange ideas, trade, commerce, all of this. And so I think that I'm worried about the dynamic that we are entering. Even the NATO wording of China's challenges is quite tough. And so somehow, in a way, we should try to find ways that we have minimum standards that everyone can agree on, so that we have the communication channels that we need to continue our exchanges and trying to understand each other better, right? But that's not really the driving force right now. We are more into a polarizing division of the world, and I think the global South generally, and I think we see it with the sanctions on Ukraine, etc., is not really buying this narrative. It's not really kind of into this game of democracies versus autocracies, and they are worried, as we should be, about this increased geopolitical rivalry between the United States and China that leads to confrontation rather than trying to increase cooperation, which is needed for a lot of the global challenges we have, including the governance of internet.
Yeah, and maybe I can build on Miguel's remarks. The existence of the European Union is a massive success story that has its roots in a successful reconciliation after World War II. And remembering how much hatred there was, triggered by 2 world wars, triggered by decades of governments and leaders across Europe fostering that hatred, it's a remarkable success story. And we reached that point, amongst others, through many analog methods. Exchanges between school children, building economic links, building cultural links. And we have to ask ourselves the question, what is the equivalent in the digital space? What is the way in which we achieve, or in which we will achieve eventually reconciliation, for example, between the people of Ukraine and Russia, once the war is hopefully over very soon? How can we, and once we've hopefully had a change of regime in Russia, so what can we do in the digital space to foster reconciliation in the long run, so that we don't enter many decades of hatred and continuation of war? So those are very big and challenging questions, but at the same time, as I said, the fact that we have the European Union as a testament to the massive success in reconciliation after World War II, and then again building bridges after the end of the Cold War, makes me cautiously optimistic.
Thank you so much. And maybe some final words from Ambassador Steele. You're muted still. You need to unmute. Oh.
You hear me?
Yes. Now.
Okay, sorry. No, it's a very interesting discussion, and I'm very glad I was able to be present. I'm as a diplomat, from my generation, we were focusing on subjects, like, I remember disarmament. We were focusing on trade. We were focusing on politics. But now you see there is a new dimension in international politics, and it's indeed, the cyber world. And I must say, I discovered that, and today I learned a lot from very eminent experts, which we were able, Matic, to assemble here. A very interesting discussion. I would like indeed, Matic, that we will learn from that, and we hope we can in the future see each other again, and maybe go deeper into the subject, and which will for me certainly be very formative. Thank you so much for coming, and I give the floor now to Matic.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And actually, maybe to sum up on the Dr. Hallensleben's note about fostering digital reconciliation, I think that's a very kind of a positive outlook, a cautiously optimistic outlook to kind of wrap up this session with, and hopefully we get a chance to, as noted by Ambassador Steele, to really dig deeper in this topic in a lot of areas, because I think we only surfaced several topics and haven't necessarily got a chance to go even further in depth. But for now, I really want to thank each and one of you for joining, for participating, and we sincerely hope that this is not the last chance that we have to dialogue. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for a great discussion.
Bye.
Have a good day.
Bye. Thank you.